Hi, and welcome to another episode of the pod. If it's your first time, welcome. If you're returning, well, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And today we're actually going to get onto a topic which is about recording and useful to people who are into recording, whether that's at home or perhaps their own studio. We're going to talk today about room setup 101, things you want to think about, and how to begin to start setting up your room. I told you would get there eventually. So there's an acoustics expert out there who says his products affect sound waves at some kind of a mysterious voodoo, molecular, quantum level. And needless to say, they're very, very expensive. And hey, maybe they do work. Nobody really knows because there's no measurements for them. And you have to sign an NDA should they build the room for you, but you know what? They look really pretty. On the opposite end of that spectrum, we have the legendary studio owner who told me, these fancy designers, they come down here from, quote, that there London, and want to charge you a fortune. Well, we just played around with things until it sounded good. And his rooms made a lot of hits through the years. Countless hits. Everything from Bohemian Rhapsody through Oasis to all kinds of stuff to the present day. Now, I can imagine all kinds of things living up there beyond the ceiling, doing some kind of absorption, as he's a very practical man and always at war with the squirrels who knock out the power to Rockville. Acoustics is confusing because on one hand, it is science, and on the other, it's kind of whatever works. I was also really very interested in this from the beginning. I studied it, and it was an essential part of learning to become an engineer. I have good news and I have bad news. Yep, there are many professionally designed rooms in the world, and most of those do sound really good. Some just sound okay, but there are many more rooms that some call studios, which I call rooms with gear in them. People spend crazy amounts of cash buying esoteric gear and talk constantly about expensive monitors, and then ask why their own mixes don't work, and often it just comes down to one factor apart from their actual ability, and that is the room. At the lower end of the market where I started, and maybe where you are, that's usually constrained by the amount of room available. Most small rooms are not designed for listening to audio, end of story. The limitations of space because of physics alone make it very hard to treat low end. And a lot of these rooms aren't set up with listening as the prime purpose of the room. More usually based on, I don't know, where things will fit or where the gear kind of looks right. So for example, is your room as symmetrical as possible at the listening position? Me, I'd put the considerations of setting up the room to sound good first every time, if possible, over everything else, and go for overkill. No matter the space I had, everything in your room will have an effect, from your choice of flooring to your wall treatment. But first, we kind of need to figure out where things are going to go in the space you have. Now, you've all seen pictures of acoustic foam tiles. These kind of gray, ridgy things look a bit like egg boxes, which are also junk. Well, many of those products are complete junk. Many of them are actually even dangerous. I used to work in the East, and this is terrible, but a bunch of my friends were killed or got burned horrifically in a club fire where they used these pieces of trash to try to improve the acoustics. It's awful. You're almost always better off going to your local builder's merchants and buying some semi-rigid rock wool slabs. They might call this RW45 or similar, and making some panels yourself. You can easily find this information on the internet. It's not difficult to do. You don't need a ton of tools. And if you don't believe me about this rock wool, look at the absorption specs. Pretty much every material has an absorption specification, and that's basically how efficient it is at absorbing each frequency depending on what it is. And you'll find that rock wool is pretty incredible at it. It's not hard to do, and you haven't really paid your dues if that nasty fiberglass rock wool hasn't given you a nasty rash at some point in your life as you work on your studio. Seriously though, be careful and use appropriate protection. It's dangerous and unpleasant. We don't want you to get some terrible illness, but it is very, very effective. If you make your wooden frame the exact size of the rock wool slab, you don't even have to cut it. And covering it in an acoustically transparent fabric will cost way less than buying anything off the shelf and work far better, I promise you. If you're loaded, then good for you. You can buy some higher end products. And I personally think there are some very strong melamine-based foam solutions out there. But this is a different kind of foam. We're talking 10 centimeter thick slabs of the stuff in huge sheets, which acoustic designers sometimes use, not these little thin tiles. It's also safe for fire risk, which is a consideration I tried to explain to you earlier, and genuinely effective, instead of just kind of looking like acoustic tiling of some kind. Another time, I hired a guy to come and help fine-tune the bass traps that I'd bought for this room I was working on. He came with a couple of hours with his laptop and reference mic, drank a lot of tea, stroked his creepy beard a few times, and charged me a few £100. Now, I made the changes he suggested with regards to the bass traps. I felt like something had happened that was positive, but the other guy that worked in the room immediately said it sucked all the life out of the room. So who knows? On paper, measured, it was flatter in the low end and sounded better to me. And we had these huge monster ATCs with dual 15s in them. But you know what? Nobody's ears are the same. If you measure your room, which is easily done with any kind of reasonably flat microphone, you'll immediately discover the horror that your room is nowhere near where it should be. And even if you treat it fairly heavily, that it won't be ideal. In the real world, though, look at a lot of rooms. Racks of nice, hard, reflective gear in the way of the audio. Big panes of glass, huge metal mixing desks, putting a big, hard, splashy surface right below the monitors, and yet we make it work. In making the transition to working in fully pro studios, I think I wanted there to be some big secret, some magic. But what I realized is the real studios, in quotey fingers, just made it easier to do what needs to be done. The effort required remains the same, but there are less factors when it comes to acoustics and design to lead you astray. So how do we begin? Well, avoid setting up in a corner and try to set up your room as symmetrically as possible. This means looking at your room, seeing which wall is going to work best with the same distance to either side of your monitors. If there's a wall on one side and an open space on the other, for the example, what do you think would happen? The distance between the walls and each speaker has a direct effect on the low end. So ideally, you want each monitor to be the same distance from the rear wall and the same distance from the side wall as each other in a smaller room. Let's say your right monitor is closer to the corner than left because of your room setup. Anything you pan right will probably sound bassier and fatter than it does to when you pan it left. Does that make sense? If you're stuck in this situation, by all means, pan it the other way and check. Same goes with the early reflections in the room, which kind of means the reflections from the closest surface to the speaker, which will be the strongest next to the direct sound coming straight out of the speakers to your ear. Same distance, same reflections. Equality is good when it comes to treatment, which I'll cover later in another episode if you're really interested. You'll often see internet people shouting about this thing called the 38% rule. What is the 38% rule? In a rectangular room, the best theoretical spot for your listening position is approximately 38% from the wall. as due to our buddy physics and the magic of the golden ratio, the average response will most likely be less problematic with peaks and nulls at that point in the room. With regard to that, I want to cover 4 points. That means 38% from either the front or rear wall. Doesn't mean just the front. Wes Lachaud, the acoustic designer and originator of the 38% rule, states, "It's a guideline, it's not a rule. Whenever you hear the word rule used in audio, start being suspicious." Now, nobody ever mentions your ceiling height when they talk about this. A room is 3-dimensional, so your floor to ceiling ratio also has a big impact upon what you're listening to. In a bigger studio, the mains are often mounted in the wall, soffit mounted. The studio is designed around that, and they are hardly ever used, and the near field position is on the meter bridge. For some scientific reason? No, just because it's there. But hey, we have to start somewhere. So, start by placing your listening position 38% of the way into the room. Why not? You just put it somewhere where it looks cool, like straight up against the wall, otherwise, wouldn't you? Don't do it. Okay, let's talk about room geometry. You have a short wall and a long wall. Which way should you set up your room? Normally, aim down the longer wall. It will take longer for the sound waves to hit the back and reflect back to your listening position, which usually results in the likelihood of there being less nulls in the bass spectrum of the listening position. So set up your listening position, then place your desk and monitors in front of that. Okay, what about things like cool-looking diffusers? They look great, but unless they're massive, you're probably going to be sadly disappointed if you look at the effective frequency range of your QRD diffuser and what it will actually diffuse. At home, you're probably not going to build something 3 feet deep, which means you're going to have practically zero effect at 100 hertz. Something 6 inches deep is only going to kick in around 650 hertz and go up to about 7K, even with very narrow wells. And the same applies to all of these fancy Skyline type diffusers, which tend to start even higher. Look beautiful, very expensive, but only realistically diffuse the high mids and top end. What about situations where you're using, a bookshelf? How effective is that? Well, any uneven surface provides diffusion, it's true, but how effective and why these high-tech quadratic diffusers have any merit comes down to the physics applied. Less application of the science, the less effective. Acoustics is pretty much straight up physics. How deep the different wells are, that's, let's say, the different sizes in the books, and how wide the books are in general, it's just not that effective. But maybe that's the vibe of your studio. Just don't get fooled into believing it's going to do something it's not. What about speaker stands? Should you use speaker stands? Yes, you should, for a few good reasons. First, it makes positioning them in the best place possible easier, as you can easily adjust distance to the rear and side walls, plus the height by moving the stand. Plus, you're not going to get any resonances or reflections like you would from a desk or whatever else you threw your monitors on. Make them heavy and solid, and the good news is they're pretty affordable. I know you've grown up seeing pictures of near fields on meter bridges, but that was more about convenience, not sound. What about speaker height? Again, I see crazy things people are doing with their speakers. Speakers on desks 2 feet below your ears, or stacks of speakers, or speakers on the wall. Well, if you can, very simply get your tweeters at or near to your ear height. If they're above or below, what happens? Well, you get less high end, which means you'll probably add too much. Although, if maybe you have a monitor which is super bright, moving it a little might actually help. What about speaker angle? Well, an equilateral triangle between you and the tweeter and the center of the tweeters relative to each other is a good starting point, angled slightly towards you, inwards about 30 degrees or so. How precise you make this triangle affects the size of your sweet spot. So that is where your ears are and the general area around where you're sitting. You want to have relative accuracy. So again, practicality overrides precision. How far from the wall should our speakers be? Well, we're going to deviate a little bit from common sense here. Since maybe we use the 38% rule to determine our listening position, we are dependent somewhat on that. It puts us a fair degree into the room, but here we go. Where things might sound best might not be the best location from the scientific point of view. This means putting your near fields closer to the back wall than you might imagine. And what you want to go for is evenness and a low end that feels right, as you will always instinctively aim for that. You can learn, you can reference, figure out how much bass is in records you like, for example, but you're always going to be pushed towards what you favor. And that might be a little bit more or a little bit less than other people. There's always going to be a bass lift as you get close to the wall. But when a monitor is between 1 and 2.5 meters from the rear wall, there can be some very hard to treat weirdness that can occur in your low end. So listen to a load of music and you'll soon find a place that feels right. It's okay to be close to the back wall. It often, in fact, gets rid of a lot of potential issues, even though technically it's wrong. You might also have some EQ settings on your monitors, and now would be the time to tinker with those. After everything is sounding as good as it can be, exhausting experimentation with your positioning. If you've made it through this podcast this far, I'm very proud of you, and I will reward you by doing another episode to tell you what to do next. I hope you enjoyed it. If it was useful, please like and rate and share this podcast so I can have some form of motivation to keep making them. All right. Well, thank you again. I've enjoyed having you here, and I'll see you next time on the pod.